A special word needs to be said about the remarkable powers of enforcement conferred upon the police. The police received powers to enforce the lockdown regulations by giving directions to citizens which it was a criminal offence to disobey. Fixed penalty notices are normally authorised by statute in modest amounts for minor regulatory infractions, parking and lesser offences. The government's regulations, however, authorised them for a great variety of newly created offences and sometimes in very large amounts. On the 26th of August, the government introduced by decree an offence of being involved in a gathering exceeding 30 people, and it empowered any policeman in the land to issue a fixed penalty notice of £10,000. This sum, enough to ruin most people, was far in excess of any fine that would be imposed by a court for such an offence. The power was originally advertised as being intended to deal with raves, but it has of course been used for much wider purposes. In particular, it has been used to suppress protests against the government's coronavirus policies. On the 30th of August, the police served a £10,000 fixed penalty notice on Mr. Piers Corbyn for addressing a rally against masks in Trafalgar Square. The regulations contain an exception for political protest, provided that the organisers have agreed a risk assessment and taken reasonable steps to ensure safety. On the 26th of September, the police broke up a demonstration against the government's measures, whose organisers had agreed a risk assessment with the local authority and had taken reasonable steps to ensure safety. The police claimed to have done this because some of the demonstrators had not acted in accordance with the arrangements made by the organisers. So they cleared the square using batons with considerable violence, injuring about 20 people who were guilty of nothing other than attending an apparently lawful protest. There is, of course, a notable piece of selection involved in these actions. No such fines, arrests, or assaults have been seen in other demonstrations, such as those organised by Black Lives Matter or Extinction Rebellion, which did not observe social distancing either, but were thought by the police to have greater public support. The Mayor of London applauded the police action on the 26th of September. The silence from civil rights organisations such as Liberty has been deafening. The police's powers of summary arrest are regulated by primary legislation, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act 1984. Under Regulation 9(7) of the original lockdown regulations, the government purported to amend that act by enlarging the police's powers of arrest so that they extended to any case in which a policeman reasonably believed that it was necessary to arrest a citizen in order to maintain public health. I need hardly say that the Public Health Act confers no power on ministers to amend other primary legislation in this way. In fact, the police substantially exceeded even the vast powers that they received. In the period immediately after the announcement of the lockdown, a number of chief constables announced that they would stop people acting in a way that they regarded as inessential, although there was no warrant for this in the regulations. One of them threatened to go through the shopping baskets of those exercising their right to obtain supplies so as to ensure that they were not buying anything that a constable might regard as inessential. Other forces set up roadblocks to enforce powers that they did not possess. Derbyshire police notoriously sent up surveillance drones and published on the internet a film clip denouncing people taking exercise in the Derbyshire fells, something which people were absolutely entitled to do. When I ventured to criticise them in a BBC interview for acting beyond their powers, I received a letter from the Derbyshire Police Commissioner objecting to my remarks on the ground that in a crisis, such things were necessary. The implication was that in a crisis, the police were entitled to do whatever they thought fit, without being unduly concerned about the limits of their legal powers. That is my definition of a police state. Now, many people think that in an emergency, public authorities should be free to behave in this way because the ordinary processes of lawmaking are too deliberate and too slow. I do not share that view. I believe that in the long run, the principles on which we are governed matter more than the way in which we deal with any particular crisis. They're particularly important in a country like ours, in which many basic rights and liberties depend on convention. They depend on a recognition, not just that governments must act within their powers, but that not everything that a government is legally entitled to do is legitimate. The Public Health Act requires any exercise of its regulation-making powers to be proportionate. The government has included in every regulation it has made to date a formulaic statement that it is. But its actions speak differently. Its public position is explicable only on the basis that absolutely anything is justifiable in the interests of hindering the transmission of the disease. I reject that claim. Powers as wide and as intrusive as those which the government has purported to exercise should not be available to a minister on his mere say-so. In a society with the liberal traditions of ours, the police ought not to have the kind of arbitrary enforcement powers that they have been given, let alone the much wider powers that they have not been given, but have sought to exercise anyway. These things should not happen without specific parliamentary authority, in the course of which the government can be required to explain and justify its proposals and expose the evidence behind them in detail, so that its proposals can be properly debated, amended, or rejected by a democratic legislature. Their imposition by decree, even if the decrees are lawful, is not consistent with the constitutional traditions of this country. Our society craves security. The public has unbounded confidence, which no amount of experience will dent, in the benign power of the state to protect them against an ever wider range of risks. In Britain, the lockdown was followed by a brief period in which the government's approval ratings were sky high. That is how freedom dies. When societies lose their liberty, it isn't usually because some despot has crushed it under his boot. It is because people voluntarily surrender their liberty out of fear of some external threat. Historically, fear has always been the most potent instrument of the authoritarian state. That is what we are witnessing today. But the fault is not just in our government, it's also in ourselves. Fear provokes strident calls for abrasive action, much of which may be unhelpful or damaging. It promotes intolerant conformism. It encourages abuse directed against anyone who steps out of line, including many responsible opponents of this government's measures and some notable scientists who have questioned their empirical basis. These are the authentic ingredients of a totalitarian society. So I regret to say is another feature of the history, namely the propaganda by which the government has to some extent been able to create its own public opinion. Fear was deliberately stoked up by the government. The language of impending doom, the daily press conferences, the alarmist projections of the mathematical modelers, the manipulative use of selected statistics, the presentation of exceptional tragedies as if they were the normal effects of COVID-19. And above all, the attempt to suggest that COVID-19 was an indiscriminate killer, when the truth was that it killed identifiable groups, notably those with serious underlying conditions and the old, who could and arguably should have been sheltered without coercing the entire population. These exaggerations were not accidental. They followed naturally from the logic of the measures themselves. They were necessary in order to justify the extreme steps which the government had taken and to promote compliance. As a strategy, this was entirely successful. So successful was it that when the government eventually woke up to the damage that it was doing, especially to the economy and to the education of children, it found it difficult to reverse course. The public naturally asked themselves, well, what had changed? The honest answer to that question would have been that nothing much had changed. The threat had just not been fairly presented in the first place.